Thank you everyone for coming today. This is the third session of the book of Genesis through the lens of ancient biblical interpretation, where we have had the pleasure of learning these past few weeks with Dr. Gafni. This course is going to introduce participants to the rich and diverse world of ancient Jewish biblical exegesis, looking at a variety of lesser-known interpretive sources. It's been a pleasure to have everyone here coming back for the third session. As in previous sessions, sources will be shared on screen as a PowerPoint. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. Gafni.
Okay, good evening. It's great to see you. And I'm going to share my screen, and then we can start. So this is our third session, and we're continuing with our presentation of ancient Jewish sources that help us, that contribute understanding stories from the Bible, with a special focus on the book of Genesis. And I want to review the type of text we've discussed in the previous two sessions and introduce the theme of our the current class. So in previous session, we started by talking, after we introduced this whole field of study, we started by talking about intertextual interpretations, meaning interpretations that are found within the Bible itself. We said that this is indeed the most ancient form of interpretation that is out there. When the Bible interprets itself, obviously it can't be earlier than that. That was the opening session. We moved on and we spoke about the books of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, apocryphal books that were considered part of the Bible in some places or communities back then, but books that did not make it into our authoritative version of the Bible, at least among within the Jewish community. These books could also be perceived as forms of interpretations of the Bible, as they also shed light or discuss scenes from other parts of the book that are part of our Bible. So in that sense, we can also view them as a form of ancient Jewish biblical interpretations. What are we up for today? So today we will devote an entire session to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Nevertheless, we will have two parts to our discussion. The first part of our class will be devoted to a brief to basically presenting the story of these scrolls, to present these type of sources. Where were they discovered, when, where, etc. In the second part, we will try to demonstrate how these texts, how the scrolls could be used as a form of interpretation to the Bible. And again, with special focus on Sefer Bereshit, on Genesis, and we will try to demonstrate that with a particular text from the Parashah that we read in the previous week in Shabbat. So first part, as I said, we're trying to become familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what we're going to do is as follows. We will talk about the discovery. Where and when did it take place? We'll discuss the tales of those scrolls, what happened to the scrolls once they were discovered. We will talk about the community in which these scrolls were written. We'll briefly discuss their content and also their significance. That's part one. In part two, will be to talk more specifically about their contribution to the understanding of the Bible and to the understanding of Sefer Bereshit in particular. So, the discovery of the Qumran scrolls. We'll start by making clear, pointing out where exactly is this Qumran, where is Qumran located. So here you have a map. Qumran was actually known in earlier sources as Schacha. That was probably its original Hebrew name. Qumran is influenced by the Arabic way of addressing this place. And here you see on the map, it's in the northern part, in the east bank of the northern part of the Dead Sea, near Kibbutz Kalia. If you've been there near the Dead Sea in the northern part, there's a kibbutz called Kibbutz Kalia. And right by that kibbutz is the location where the ancient site of Qumran is found. I would say about a half-hour drive, maybe 45 minutes drive away from Yerushalayim. So when does our story start? When we want to talk about the story of Qumran and the discovery of the scrolls. So where does the story start? When does our tale start? So people often tell the story or start the story from the mid-20th century, but the story actually starts way before, into the 19th century. already in the 1850s, there were some archaeologists who realized that in the area of Qumran, there was some sort of ancient Jewish village, or at least a place where people lived in some form or another. And especially is remarkable the work of this guy, this archaeologist, British archaeologist. His name was Charles Simon Ganot. There were first other British archaeologists, but then he came. He visited in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, between the years, for many years, but for our interest, he was between 1873 and 1874, taking accounts of all sorts of sites in Palestine. And one of the places where he visits is the site of Qumran. Here you see a map that was sketched during his lifetime. You see it says here, Khirbat Qumran, or the remains of Qumran. What's this word stand for? C-A-M. So this is an ancient cemetery that he found. That's the first thing that was discovered in this region, in this territory, in the region of Qumran. What he did not find, unfortunately for him, were all the scrolls and all the caves in which these scrolls were kept. So he did realize that there was an interesting site, but he didn't realize he didn't actually find the most important, precious thing that was hiding just, under his nose. So this is the first discovery, 1873. And then we move back, we move many years in time. And now that comes the more familiar story. In 1947, just before the state of Israel was declared, in November 29th, 1947, a bunch of shepherds, Bedouin shepherds, are watching their goats, sheep, whatever that was. And one of those sheep, I'm sure you know the story, but we'll still tell it over again. One of the sheep gets lost into one, and seems to have walked into one of those caves in the desert. The younger shepherd throws a tiny rock in order to get this goat out. And rather than having the goat come out, he hears a vessel that breaks. In many, many records that tell this story, people would often say that this broken vessel was heard all over the world, because it was actually one of the most important discoveries ever. When you think about it from an archaeological perspective, even in thinking about it universally in the entire world history, this is probably one of the most important discoveries, the most ancient copies. And I don't mean tiny fragments, but actually many copies of the Bible were found for the first time. So these are the two shepherds that actually found that through the rock, and they belong to this tribe called the Ed Dib tribe. These are their names. And what do? They threw the rock, they heard the vessel. Initially, the younger guy ran home. He was so scared when he heard the vessel break. He returns the following day with his father, and they see this broken vessel, and inside what was or were these ancient scrolls. This is the original cave, and this is what the vessels used to look like. This is the cover, and this is the vessel itself. And they found a few of those vessels. One of them was broken, and the other ones were still standing there in the cave. So what do you do with this? They didn't really have much of a clue what needs to be done with ancient parchment. And the first thing that came to mind, what do you do with parchment, with a piece of skin, leather? What can you make out of them?
Shoes?
Shoes.
Excellent. So this is a nice story in comics that tells the story of the discovery, if you want to show your kids afterwards. So this is what they first, now we're moving on to the next stage, the tales of these scrolls. So the first thing that came to their mind, let's bring it to a shoemaker, and perhaps he could make it, turn it into shoes. That's a real story. That's not my part of it's not my own addition. This is the real story. They go to Bethlehem, to the city of Bethlehem on the southern part of Yerushalayim, and they asked some shoemaker if he can turn this into shoes. The shoemaker was smart enough to tell them, I think that it might be worthwhile examining this ancient fragment before turning them into some ordinary pair of sandals. And they bring the scrolls that they found to one of these antique dealers or collectors. His name was Kandu, who had a small store in Bethlehem. Right by the shoemaker's store, there was another store of his. And he was smart enough to realize that this is something that is worthwhile observing and checking. And he takes the scrolls that they gave him, and they will end up in two separate places. So what happened to those scrolls? So the first three scrolls, in Hebrew they're called Megillat HaMilchama, Megillat HaHodayot, and Megillat Yeshayahu HaShniyah. In English, the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. Also in Hebrew, it has sometimes a different name. The Thanksgiving scroll and Isaiah B. So those three scrolls remain in Bethlehem. So here you see the route. This is a modern map, obviously, but you can tell what the way they made. So they moved all the way from Qumran to the area of Bethlehem, and that's where they remained there by some antique dealer waiting to be sold. And the rumor made its way to Yerushalayim. And this archaeologist, his name is Eliezer Sukenik. We mentioned him also in another session before. So he was a very important archaeologist working in the Hebrew University archaeology department. And he understood that this is something that needs to be bought by the state of Israel as soon as possible. On the day, the same day where the state was declared, on the 29th of November 1947, when the UN declared the state of Israel, he made his way from Yerushalayim to Bethlehem. It was a very dangerous bus ride that he took. He met this antique dealers, and they were discussing what should be done with those scrolls. Sukenik writes in his memoir that he was trying to sound very calm and cool and not express any strong wish to get these to put his hand on those scrolls, because he knew that the more eager he looks, the price will go up. So he was just playing it cool, and he managed to get the first three scrolls into Medinat Israel, into the state of Israel. Back then, Bethlehem was outside the land of Israel. It was 1947. So the first three scrolls make their way to Yerushalayim, and they were the first three scrolls that were redeemed by the state of Israel. However, these shepherds found four scrolls, not just those three. The other ones from Bethlehem were brought, and the other ones are called Pesher Chavakuk. We will talk about the content of each of these scrolls. Pesher Chavakuk, Megillat HaSrachim, HaMegillah HaChitzonit, Sefer Bereshit, Megillat Yeshayahu HaShlema, Pesher Chavakuk, Community Roll, Genesis, Apocryphon, and Isaiah B. I think it's not Isaiah B, it's Isaiah A. So these four scrolls from Bethlehem were brought to Yerushalayim. In a sense, we could say they were brought from the Dead Sea eventually to Yerushalayim. They didn't end up in Bethlehem. And in Bethlehem, in Jerusalem, they were kept in this church. This church still exists, looks exactly like what you see in the picture here. This is an Assyrian church right near the Jewish quarter in the old city, and that's where the scrolls were kept for a short time, waiting to be sold to any interesting institution or scholar that would want to purchase it. But unfortunately, what happens? These scrolls got lost. Nobody knew what happened to them. The monastery moved them on to some dealer, and somehow we don't know what happened to these four scrolls. They got out of reach. The state of Israel was still showing interest in purchasing these four scrolls as well, but somehow or another, nobody knew, but the scrolls got lost. We're going to go back to their story in a few minutes. You have to be patient. It's a short class, so you'll hear the end of the story soon. The Bedouins here, that this is something that might be worth their time rather than just dealing with their goats and sheep. Maybe they should look for more scrolls, because they realize that this is something that has potential for as a nice source of income. So after 1947 until the late 1950s, scholars, archaeologists, and at the same time, Bedouins start looking all over in the Dead Sea to find additional caves and perhaps additional scrolls. And it was actually a very successful move, a very wise step to take. In a short time, not just one cave, you see cave number one is the first cave that they found. Now we know already have 11 caves in the same region. We're talking about within 2 kilometers, 11 caves, and all these caves stored many, many scrolls. We're talking about many hundreds of scrolls, or altogether, not hundreds of scrolls, many hundreds, close to 1,000 fragments. Some fragments are very large. The largest fragments could be 11 meters long, and some of them are just tiny pieces, but we're talking about a numerous amount of scrolls. Some were in those jars or vessels, and some were just lying out there. So this is already becoming a whole collection. It's not just 7 scrolls as people thought at the beginning, but it becomes, people realize very soon that we're talking about something very dramatic that could turn into a major discovery. What happens with these scrolls? Where do they end? What do people do with these scrolls? So Qumran at the time was under Jordanian rule. It was not under under the Israeli state borders, but rather in the Jordanian border. And therefore, these scrolls here, you see another cave. This is cave number 4. Since it was in Jordanian borders or territory, so it belongs by law to the Jordanian government, and they were brought to a very important museum in the eastern side of Jerusalem, in the part that was ruled by Jordan at the time. This is the old city in Jerusalem. So you see here, this is the Kotel and the Temple Mount. And here, right here, you see that there's a place called the Rockefeller Museum. The Rockefeller Museum is in the eastern part of Jerusalem, back then ruled by the Jordanians. Here you can see the border between the Israeli state and the Jordanian state. So back then it's in the Jordanian territory. And all the scrolls that were found were brought there. And scholars starting taking the first steps, opening the scrolls and trying to decipher and read what these scrolls say. This is the Rockefeller Museum. This is a picture from the late 20th century. It's a gorgeous building, and it's still open to the public, although the scrolls are not there anymore. But this is where they were stored. And here you can see a few of the scrolls analyzed by some scholars already in the 1880s. But this is a little bit later than the time that we're talking about. So the scrolls now are under Jordanian rule, belong to the Jordanian government. But if you remember, after 1967, the eastern part of Jerusalem was taken over by the Israeli state. And at that moment, also all these scrolls become Israeli, belonged to the Israeli state. And that's the way it remained since then. The scrolls remained in the Rockefeller Museum for a short time. Later on, they moved to the Israel Museum near the Knesset. I'm sure you've been there. And that's where they're stored nowadays. The story doesn't end here. A few more important things to add. This is Sukenig's son. Sukenig's son. Sukenig is the guy who purchased the first scrolls on behalf of the Hebrew University, indirectly for the purpose for the state of Israel. His son was also very involved in archaeology, and he was giving talks all over the world about the scrolls. I actually gave a talk a few days ago in some place in Jerusalem and in some old age home in Jerusalem. And one of the members told me that she heard him give a talk in 1959. Adin, this guy that you see in the picture, about the scrolls. So he was traveling all over the world doing all sorts of stuff. And in one of his journeys to New York, a friend of his informs him that he saw this interesting ad in the Wall Street Journal. You see, this is an ad from the 1950s. For sale, the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 years BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift for an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. And they give the information. Yadin immediately realized that these are the 4 scrolls that got lost. Today we know exactly how did they end up in New York, but these are the 4 scrolls that people didn't know from the first cave that these Bedouins found. So somehow they made their way to New York by all sorts of antique dealers or institutions. Yadin heard about this, informed the Israeli state, and the Israeli state purchased immediately all 4 scrolls for $250,000, which is pennies compared to what they're worth today. Today we're talking about $250 million, probably closer to that. Crazy numbers. Back then it was a great deal, a great bargain for the state of Israel. And all 4 scrolls were shipped back from Kennedy Airport to Jerusalem. And they were actually transported in 4 different airplanes. They were so precious, they didn't want the airplane to crash and lose all 4 of them. So they sent them in 4 different flights. And that's how all these scrolls ended up in the Israel Museum. Have you been in the Israel Museum? I'm sure some of you have been there before. Have you? In the Israel Museum? Yes. So what is this white thing? This is the shrine of the book, but what is this supposed to look like? What is this shape, weird shape, and why this color?
The top of the thing that held it.
Right. It's the top, the cover of the vessel of where the scrolls were found, and it's in white. The whole site there is black and white because one of the scrolls is called Megillat Bnei Or Bivnei Choshech, the sons of light against the sons of dark. So everything in the site in the museum is black and white, and this is the place where the scrolls are found. If you visit the Israel Museum now, if you pay a visit when you come to Yerushalayim, so actually the scrolls that are on exhibit are not the real ones. They're all just fake scrolls. There's only one real scroll at a given moment because they're too nervous that they're going to get destroyed if they don't have the precise temperature and humidity. They're below ground level. The real ones are below ground level. So these are the scrolls. All the scrolls today are found in the Israeli state under and they're owned by the Israeli state, except for one scroll. There was one scroll that at the time was being studied in Jordan, in Amman, the capital of the Jordan state, and therefore they remained in Amman even after the 1967 war. This is called Megillat HaNechoshet, and this scroll is still found in Jordan until this moment. But the other scrolls are all found in today in Yerushalayim. So this is the brief description of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or of the Qumran scroll. We told this story, and we even discussed briefly some information about these scrolls since then. Who wrote these scrolls? Or who are the members of the community in which the scrolls were written? So this is a big matter of debate. Scholars argue about this for many, many decades, and we're not going to resolve this problem and make something 100% clear about this. But I do want to address the considerations or the ways that people are trying to get a sense of the nature of this community. So if I were to ask you, how can we tell who are the people who wrote these scrolls? How can we come up with any conclusions or give us a brief description of the nature of this community? What would be our sources for reconstructing or coming up with any idea of the people who are writing the scroll? What would you do if I sent you a home assignment? Tell me who wrote these scrolls. Can you describe the people who lived in that community? What do we know about them? So what would be our tools, or what would be our sources?
What they wrote about.
Excellent. One thing would be analyze the scrolls themselves and try to guess from the scrolls if we can learn something about the type of people that were there. Yes.
Look for ancient records, Josephus, I don't know what.
Excellent.
Describe who lived in that area.
Perfect. So we can look in the scrolls that were found there. We can also look for external sources, such as Josephus is probably the best example, but not just Josephus, also Chazal, rabbinic literature can give us some information. Maybe Christian sources. So other option would be not examining the scrolls, but rather examining Jewish records of the period, external records that talk about the people who are out there in the desert. What else could we do?
Archaeological finds of the
right. Look at the site, not just the scrolls, but also examine the sites where they were found. So you see, you got the answer right. I put here three illustrations. One is the site, one is Josephus, and one is the scrolls. Those are the main three sources. When I bring Josephus, I mean external sources. We can also include, as I mentioned, rabbinic literature. There were periods when, if you would go to visit the Qumran site, that the site was presented in very Christian, with a very important, very clear, visible Christian emphasis. They wanted to describe the site as if this could have been something that would resemble a Christian community or a place where Jesus might have made his earlier years. I think it was mainly done for tourist purposes. They wanted to make Christian tourists come and visit the site, and it was very attractive to present it in Christian light. Today, the site has changed. They actually changed their film, and all the description of the site is not so Christian oriented. But nevertheless, there is still some question marks that are left out there. Most scholars would say that the people who live there are Isim or Essens, one of the groups that is mentioned in Josephus. In Chazal, in rabbinic literature, this group does not appear ever. However, we do have another group of people called the Baitosim, and there are scholars that think that the Baitosim of Chazal are the same as the Essenes mentioned in Josephus. The Essenes probably were connected somehow with the Sadducees ideology, but it's a sect that also departed from the main concentration of the Sadducees in Yerushalayim and moved to the desert. We know that they were extremely concerned with purity laws, and they had very clear, many restrictions for joining the sect and staying there. And a question that also was very common among scholars: the role of women in the sect. Did they take part? Didn't they take part? Again, all sorts of opinions. We're not going to get there, but you should know it's also a question that was discussed for many decades. So this is briefly about the discovery itself and the community that possibly are responsible for the scrolls we're going to describe in a minute. Obviously, not every scroll has to be a reflection of the sect itself, and we'll address this in a second. Okay, so we spoke about the discovery, we spoke about the tales of the Megillot, Alilot HaMegillot, and we also spoke about the community in Qumran. We'll say a few words about the scrolls themselves, and then we will talk more specifically about the contribution of the scrolls in terms of as a form of, or as a source of commentary to the Bible, and particularly to Sefer Bereshit. So a few things, a few facts. Let's number-wise, as I said, we're talking about close to 1,000 fragments. Some of them are 11 meters long, I mentioned, and some of them are just brief fragments, small fragments. But we're talking about a very large number of texts. What languages?
I'll go with Aramaic.
Aramaic. What else?
Greek,
Other ideas? Greek. One more. Aramaic, Greek,
Hebrew,
Hebrew, of course. So those are the three languages. Probably the majority of the texts are in Hebrew, some in Aramaic, and some in Greek. As to the script, we'll address the script in a second. They were spread in all those caves. Some were in those vessels, and some were just lying out there without maybe wrapped in some sort of paper or with some sort of cloth. But we're talking about all languages, different types of scripts. When we try to classify the different scrolls into groups, so there are many ways of doing that, but I want to use one type of classification, or one way to sort the scrolls that were found. And I want to divide them into three categories, or three groups. One we could call sectarian rolls, neutral scrolls, and biblical scrolls. So what is each group all about? Let's start with the simple ones. Biblical scrolls are scrolls with texts from the Bible. Even that is not so simple, but we'll just present them as one category. Hundreds of texts from the Bible were found in Qumran. In some cases, we have numerous copies of the same book, and in other cases, there are books that are entirely missing in the library of Qumran. Which book is entirely missing? I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Esther.
Esther. So the book of Esther was not found. Coincidence? We don't really know, but the book of Esther was not found. Some books were more popular than others. We can get a sense which books did people like to read more than others. And it's not always what we would expect. Not what we find interesting is necessarily what they found interesting. Some books from the Torah, some scrolls from the Torah, and other scrolls are from the prophets or the writings. So we have a presentation of all the books in the Bible there. The biblical scrolls are not identical, meaning even if we find numerous scrolls of the same book, it doesn't mean that they're 100% identical, both in terms of the type of script that is being used, or in terms of the letters themselves, the nusach, the version of the Bible that they present. We're not talking about different Bibles, but they're not 100% identical. They're different textual versions that are reflected in the same in those caves.
When you say script, do you mean like the font?
Yeah, so we'll talk about the script in a second. Yeah, we'll address this in a second. The second category is here. So here you have an example of a biblical scroll. This is from, you see on the bottom, it says 11 QPS2 or something like that. What does this mean? So 11 is the number of the cave where it was found. 11 Qumran, maybe it also resembles the sound cave. PS stands for which book in the Bible?
Psalms.
Psalms, Tehillim, right? And then on the bottom, you have a tiny letter, which is the particular number of fragments in that scrolls of the book of Tehillim, of Sefer Tehillim, of Psalms. Can you read this? We need to save so much time. We're still a little bit behind.
Ner
read it?
leraglo.
ner
ner
לרגלי דבריך, אור לנתיבתי, נשבעתי ואקיימה לעשות משפט צדקך. This is from Sefer Tehillim. It's Kuf Yutet 119. And this is actually, you can read the letters.
Oh, they all start with
resembles-
nun.
Yeah, that's because that's the Perek in Tehillim goes by the alphabet, and each
Right.
letter has more than one line, 7 lines. What's interesting here is that when it comes to the name of God, here, for example, Nidvot pi retzeh Hashem u'mishpatecha lamdeni. This is the name of God. When it comes to the name of God, they used a different script. You remember, you were asking me about the type of script. So this is the modern Assyrian script, and this is an ancient version of the alphabet, the Proto-Canaanite, or something that resembles the Proto-Canaanite script. It's interesting that within the same scroll, they might change. There are many, many suggestions. Why did they not want to write the name of God using the same Assyrian script? Was it because they perceived that as more holy, using the ancient type of script? Or perhaps alternatively, because it was actually not considered the authoritative type of way of reading the Bible, because now we're using the Assyrian script, and they didn't want to write the name of God with the real or accepted type of alphabet. So there are all sorts of ideas, but here we see an example of different fonts within one document. But you can also find documents that have more letters written in the ancient form of the alphabet and some more with the modern Assyrian version. So this is a biblical scroll. Another category is what we would call sectarian scrolls. Scrolls that talk about or that present, that reflect the ideology or also the legal understanding, the legal conceptions of the community in particular. Things that are not universal like the Bible, but rather texts that talk about the particular unique ideology of the people who live there or the norms of living, the way that they perceive halakha. This text is called Megillat Bnei Or B'Bnei Choshech. We mentioned this before, the war of the sons of the light with the sons of the dark. And this text is an apocalyptic description of some war in the future in which the people who live in the desert would beat everybody in the world and will rule what will be left after these battles. So this is a sectarian scroll. There are numerous other sectarian compositions. So biblical scrolls, sectarian scrolls, and finally, there are all those neutral scrolls, scrolls that are not fragments of the Bible, but at the same time, they don't necessarily reflect the unique and particular beliefs of the community. Those are texts that could have been written elsewhere, that we found, that scholars found in Qumran. They're not necessarily associated with a particular understanding and views of the people who lived in the Dead Sea, but they happen to make it into the library, and they're not part of our Bible. The neutral scrolls will play an important role, and soon we will see. We'll see which scroll is this. In the picture, we'll tell the story of this particular scroll, which plays a very important role in the interpretation of the Torah and particularly of Sefer Bereshit. I want to now address the contribution. So this was part 1 of our class. We told the story of the scrolls, the discovery, the tales, the community, the type of scrolls that were found. And obviously there's so much more to say. We can devote many, many classes for the story of the scrolls and discuss the different type of texts that were found and their significance in so many levels, history, halakha, everything. I want to focus now on the contribution of the scrolls for understanding the Torah. So part 2, the Dead Sea Scrolls as commentary to the Torah. I'll say a few words of introduction, and then we'll talk about 2 types of genres that are going to be crucial or that have special importance. The first one is psharim, and the second one is what we could call rewritten Bible compositions. So we'll start with a brief introduction. When scholars deal with the scrolls and they try to use them as a source of interpretation, they encounter different problems that are true for all the scrolls, but also with regards to this particular field of study. So what are the main difficulties? A, it is difficult to decipher the text of many of the scrolls. The letters are often blurry and non-coherent. Some words are missing. So that's a difficulty that scholars face whenever they study any scroll, but also scrolls that have to do with commentaries to the Torah. Two, it is difficult to determine the possible connections between small scroll fragments. Different fragments might be originally attached together. Modern technology has advanced this greatly. I'm talking about even in the last 10 years, with all sorts of techniques. People are managing to combine small fragments. They're also managing to decipher layers of writings. Sometimes what we have on the scroll is just the latest layer, but maybe the paper or the fragments were recycled, and maybe you can also find older texts on the same fragment. So with modern technology, with all sorts of devices, a lot of progress was made, but that's obviously another issue. So deciphering the text and creating one large fragment out of many, many small pieces that are not necessarily found together. I just want to point out, when the Bedouins were selling the scrolls, when they realized that the scrolls were so precious, they would often cut them into pieces so they can sell, rather than one scroll, they can send 10 pieces. And the state of Israel made this law that the larger the piece is, the more money you get. So it's not just that they were trying to encourage the Bedouins to keep pieces as one fragment rather than destroying them. And they did that by reimbursing them with larger amounts of money if they bring a larger scroll or a larger piece. Finally, it is also difficult when we deal with the Bible, and this is more particular for our discussion. It is difficult sometimes to distinguish between a biblical text and a biblical interpretation, especially because the text in Qumran scroll, the Bible, the biblical scrolls, are not 100% identical to the Masoretic text that we use today. So if somebody was trying to add words of explanation into the scroll, maybe they perceive that as their Bible. We don't really know if those texts were meant to serve as a form of interpretation to the Bible, or that's just an alternative version of the Bible that was kept in those scrolls. So all these are some of the questions, some of the mysteries that are out there when we examine these scrolls, and also within the realm of interpretation. Two types of Megillot, two types of scrolls of our special interest for our discussion, and I'll address them briefly. The first type is called what scholars refer to as Psharim. Pesher, maybe a good way of translating it, is an attempt to decipher or to explain, to shed light on a text that is a little bit unclear, or a text that the meaning is a little bit vague. In many of the scrolls, we found a key word that repeats itself. They would quote a verse from the book, and after the verse, they would say, Pishro, meaning the meaning of this text is as follows. Here you see in the picture a text from a scroll that was found in the 4th cave, and you see here it brings a verse from Sefer Bereshit, from Genesis, I think it's 49, from the blessings of Yaakov. Reuven bechori ata kochi veroshit ani yeter set veyeter az pachas kamayim al totar ki alita mishkavei avicha az chilat eitzui ala. I read the verse in the Masoretic version. In the Megillah, it's actually written slightly different. So you have the text. This is, you see here, I'm trying to show you with my arrow. So you see here, pachazda kamayim al totar. So we see the words alita, and here mishkavei avicha. And after the text would be quoted, it says afterwards, Pishro, meaning it means, or this is what the text is talking about. Here you have the, on the bottom, you see what the word actually says, Pishro, what this means, what Jacob was telling Reuben when he's blessing, cursing him. He's reproaching him for having spent time with Bilhah, his Pilegesh. So this is one type of interpretation, Psharim. We don't have so many of those, but obviously this is a very interesting, local, it's not a long interpretation, very more concise additions but this is one type of interpretation. In Sefer Bereshit, the Psharim to Sefer Bereshit that are here are almost on a pshat level. They're almost trying to explain the simple meaning of those texts. But the Psharim also are used in other forms. Here you see one of the first scrolls that was found called Pesher Chavakuk. Pesher Chavakuk is an attempt to read Pesher Chavakuk and interpret the prophecies there with connection to the people who lived in the sect. So this is, in a sense, an interpretation to the Bible, but also a sectarian scroll. In Sefer Chavakuk, there are all these prophecies that are very vague. And what the people in the sect did, when they read the prophecy, they say this prophecy is surprisingly about us. Everything there. So they would take verse by verse and will say, oh, this verse is speaking about Moreh HaTzedek, the community leader. And they go verse by verse. They break the prophecy into verses, or sometimes even half verses, and interpret them in light of their own life experiences or with regards to their own community. So these are psharim. This is one type of interpretation that was found in Qumran. Another type of interpretation, and this is what I want to end with, is the what we would call rewritten Bible. Texts that are, in a sense, parallel to biblical texts that we have today, to the biblical compositions, but could be also viewed as a form of interpretation. And when I say text, I'm essentially referring to one particular scroll that drew a lot of interest among scholars. It's called the Genesis Apocryphon, the external book to the book of Genesis, or in Hebrew they call it Hamegillah Hachitzonit LeSefer Bereshit. You see it in the picture, and that's how the scroll was discovered. It was discovered in the first cave, that was in cave 1, and it was not in a vessel, which means what? You can just guess.
Not as well preserved.
Yeah, that's a nice way of presenting it. It was an awful shape, and it was hard to open the scroll. Parts of it, the parts that were lying on the ground, became rotten. They were in terrible shape. Even now, we can't decipher those words. It was very hard to, and some parts of the scroll just diminished over the years, were just lost. But after many, many years of work, people today are managing to read the text, even though it's very blurry and unclear. This text,
So it's been unrolled.
it has been unrolled. Yeah, right. By now, you can see the text. I should have mentioned before, in the Israel Museum, there's a website, and you can see all the scrolls online. Sometimes it's hard to trace the scroll you're looking for, especially when you're talking about these tiny fragments with 2 words or 3 words. But everything is online, so you can see it. If you give a class and you want to demonstrate stuff, it's very easy. I didn't do the hard work. I was taking pictures from all sorts of places online. But in the website of the Israel Museum, you can find everything. You can really see everything. What is this scroll all about? So it took many, many years to open the scroll. Initially, it was just called the 4th scroll because nobody knew what was in it. When they opened it at the beginning, they saw the name Lemech. If you remember, Lemech is a figure that is mentioned in Parashat Bereshit, the first portion of Genesis, and people called this Megillat Lemech for a short time because they thought this is about him. Eventually, scholars realized that it's not just covering the story of Lemech, it's covering numerous stories in the first half of the book of Genesis mainly, and the name that was given to it is Hamegillah Chitzonit, the Sefer Bereshit, the Genesis Apocryphon. And the book is a very interesting composition. The text is in Aramaic, and some parts of it almost appear as a translation of our Bible, of Sefer Bereshit, of the book of Genesis. But since we have major additions, full paragraphs that are inserted into the book, into the text itself, we can't view this just as a form of translation, and scholars view this as a rewritten version of the Bible. It's an attempt to tell the story of Sefer Bereshit, but with major additions and deviations from the real text, adding all sorts of elements into it. So some parts of the book are almost a translation, Aramaic translation of our Sefer Bereshit, but other parts are can be seen as large additions. It belongs to this genre of rewritten Bible, just like we saw in the Apocrypha that there are those books that appear as a rewritten description of the stories in the Torah. So does this book. And I want to use one example. This is the example I'm giving you is not my own discovery. It's from the story of Abraham descending to the land of Egypt. We'll read the text in the Bible, in the Torah, and we'll address some of the questions that troubled scholars in antiquity, and we'll see what the scroll can add in this realm. So we're starting with the text in the Torah. I'm reading it in Hebrew, first because we need to start with the Hebrew, and also because I want us to do the Hebrew first, and then we'll do briefly the English. What does the text say? Does anybody want to read Hebrew? Bereshit, Yud Bet, Yud Aleph, Ad Kaf. This is the text that we just read last week in Parashat Lech Lecha. So I'm reading, unless somebody wants to read. Okay. Vahi kasher hikriv. This is a text describing Abraham's journey to Egypt. Vahi kasher hikriv lavo Mitzrayma. Vayomer el Sarah ishto. Hinena yadati ki isha yefat mar'eat. והיה כי יראו אותך המצרים ואמרו אשתו זאת והרגו אותי ואותך יחיו. אמרינה אחותי את, למען ייטב לי בעבורך וחייתה נפשי בגללך. English, to make it more simple, in the English description, there was no food in the land of Canaan, and therefore Abraham goes to Egypt. As he enters Egypt, he tells his wife Sarah, he said to his wife Sarah, behold, I know that you are a beautiful woman. And if the Egyptians see you and think you are my wife, they will kill me and let you live. Please say that you are my sister, that I may go well with me because of you, and that I may remain alive thanks to you. So this is what the text is saying. The text here raises many questions. I want to talk about two important questions. One is an ethical question, and another one is a more technical, linguistic issue. What's the ethical issue that comes up? And you read this text, ethical problem. I don't think I need to explain too much.
He's telling her not to say the truth.
Not to say the truth, and also it's beyond that. What was he expecting here? What is he going to, if she says she's his sister, obviously she's going to be taken, as indeed happened, taken to the palace of Pharaoh, and who knows what's going to happen to her there. He's saving his own life by imposing on Sarah to lie, to deceive the people at the border, and eventually also to be taken to the house of Pharaoh just to save him. How can Abraham do such a thing? That's the first question. But on a more technical level, there's also something problematic. In Hebrew, it says that he tells his wife, I have just came to realize how beautiful you are. I deliberately chose an English translation that keeps that meaning, although there are other translations out there. Behold, I know now that you're a beautiful woman. And the question is also what? He didn't realize that before. What does that mean? I just came to realize that you're such a beautiful person. What does that mean? So a linguistic question and also a larger ethical problem. Before we make progress, I want to mention that before we look into the scrolls, I want to point out that this question is an ancient question that was also addressed by books that we mentioned in the previous session, in the Apocrypha. It was also addressed in Chazal, in rabbinic literature. It's not just a question that will be resolved in the scrolls. So I want to bring a few examples. There's also an intertextual comparison here that I'm not going to elaborate on. But let's see. How does the book of Jubilees that we spoke about last week, how does he address this problem? We'll read it immediately in English because we don't have the original Hebrew here. And Abraham, tell me how did he resolve the problem? And Abraham went into Egypt in the third year of the week, and he dwelt in Egypt 5 years before his wife torn away from him. And it came to pass when Pharaoh sees Pharaoh, the wife of Abraham, that the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his wife in his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. How did he deal with this ethical problem?
Change the story.
He just avoided it altogether. He just skipped that part. Abraham just went to Egypt. His wife was seized. How did that happen? We don't know. That's one strategy. Chazal, in rabbinic literature, Chazal are not so much better in that sense. Midrash Tanchuma, one of the Midrashim, this is the way he tells the story of Abraham going to Egypt. He told her, I will hide you in a cabinet and lock it. He did so. He put her, in Hebrew it says, אני נותן אותך בתיבה ונועל אותך. So he hid her. He put her in his luggage. As he was about to cross the Nile, the tax collector gathered about him and asked, "What are you carrying in the cabinet?" "Barley," he replied. They retorted, "It is not barley, but wheat," meaning something more precious that you pay larger taxes for. This is when Abraham makes the mistake. He should have said, "No, it's barley," but he made the mistake. He said, "Then charge me for the duty for wheat." That as soon as he said that, I'm sure the the people there were already very suspecting him. But maybe big pepper, they argued. "Then take the tax for pepper," he insisted. They said to him, "It must be gold coins." Finally, they compelled him to open the box. When they beheld her countenance, which was as radiant as the sun. So what's Chazal's strategy? How did they deal with Abraham's demand for Sarah to deceive the people there? Again,
They excuse his ethical lapse.
yeah, they just avoid talking about this and they give a different description. He actually hit her. All this is saying something about the embarrassment that Chazal or in Second Temple literature people were facing. There are also different ways that the rabbis were trying to deal with the linguistic problem. What does that mean that Abraham got to know how beautiful Sarah was just then? So I'll give you a few ideas. In Midrash Rabbah, they say it was when he drew near to come to Egypt, he was together with her. So the Midrash asked, he was there together with her for all those years. And only now he says to her, "Behold, I know now that you're a woman of fair appearance." The explanation is that due to travel, a person usually becomes unsightly. But this one retained her beauty. So that's one way of explaining what did he try to say by saying, "I came to know how beautiful you are." Another way in Midrash, they say, he never looked at Sarah before. It was only when they were about to cross the Nile, when they were standing on the bank of the Nile, our patriarch Abraham noticed that Sarah's reflection in the river was like the radiance of the sun. So he never looked at her before. It's only when when their images are reflected in the water, he saw her for the first time. All sorts of interesting ideas. Let's turn now to the Megillah, to the Megillah Chitzonit LeSefer Bereshit, and see what they say. And as I mentioned, this is not my discovery. I'll refer to you to all the sources where you can read. And it's just one example. It's a fascinating example. So this is what the text there says. Anybody wants to read? 2 slides. Now we passed out of our land. When you have places like this, where I put 3 dots, it could be that I made it short because I just needed to make it more concise. Or sometimes I'll point out the text itself is unclear. And that's why I'm skipping a few words here. Okay.
Oh, well,
Now we passed.
Now we passed out of our land and entered the land of the children of Ham, the land of Egypt. And I, Avram, dreamed a dream during the night of my entering the land of Egypt. I saw in my dream 1 cedar tree and 1 palm tree, and human figures came and tried to chop down and uproot the cedar in order to leave the palm by itself. But the palm restrained them. And she said, or when she said, "Do not chop down the cedar, for both of us are from one root." And the cedar was left alone thanks to the protection of the palm and was not chopped down.
Okay, you're continuing. You're not done yet.
I woke up from my dream in the night and said to Sarai, my wife, "I have dreamed a dream and I am afraid. Tell me your dream." And so I began to relate this dream to her, and I revealed to her the meaning of that dream. And I said, "For they will seek to kill me, but you they will spare. This, every favor which you must do for me in every place where we are, say of me that he is my brother, and I will remain alive by your protection and survive thanks to you. They will try to remove you from me and to kill me." And Sarai wept over my words that night.
Okay, this is an amazing text. Now, I want to make one thing clear before we get into the details. Don't expect pshat, literal meaning of the text. Obviously, it's a creative way of reading the Torah. What's fascinating here that it's, as I said, it's an alternative description. It doesn't quote a verse and explain it. It's an alternative rewritten version of the story of the Torah. But when you read it, as scholars pointed out, I'll soon mention the name of the scholar that I'm referring to, you can see that he's addressing our problems, but in a very creative way. What is he suggesting? We were asking, how dare does Abraham say to his wife, you should lie on my behalf, you should risk your life or risk your body just to save me? That was one question we asked. And we also asked, what does it mean when he says, Hine na yadati? I just came to realize, but he didn't know how beautiful she was before. What is he suggesting? How does he overcome the ethical problem?
Well,
What's his?
he's basically saying, God put this in my head
Right.
when I
He's
slept.
is
It's like
attributing
Joseph's dreams, and
exactly. Essentially, what the scribe of this scroll is saying, what Abraham does is not just his own initiative. It's not his own crazy idea. He's essentially following what God is trying to tell him. The dream is often associated with some divine guidance or revelation. And when he's telling Sarah what he's doing, he's describing her what he saw in the dream. And when you read his dream, you see that Abraham is pretty close to what I would, what anybody would read into the dream. We're talking about two trees that, and only one tree is able to save the other. So Abraham immediately deduces the obvious conclusion that this is what he's supposed to do. And that's what indeed he tells Sarah. So it's not Abraham's own idea. Where's this all rooted in the text? Where can he get this idea from that this is some sort of divine revelation or divine instruction? So here we get to the second element that we were addressing. In our verse, Abraham says, Hine na yadati, I just came to realize. Usually scholars understood the way the plain sense probably means, I just came to realize how beautiful you are. But the scroll read this in a very creative manner. Abraham's sentence does not end there. Let's go back to Abraham's sentence in the Torah. Abraham doesn't end by saying, Hinena yadati ki isha yifat mar'eat. His sentence doesn't end by saying, I just came to realize what a beautiful woman are. The sentence continues, I just came to realize that you're a beautiful woman, and I came to realize that the Egyptians are about to kill me and save you. All of this is part of the Hinena Yadati. I came to know. And how did he come to know all of this? It's a long description of his dream. When he says, I came to realize, he's not saying, I came to realize that you're a beautiful woman. I came to realize the following. I came to realize how? Through a dream. That what? That since you're a beautiful woman, what's about to happen is that the Egyptians will see you and say, this is his wife, and kill me, and say, all of this in his creative way of reading the verse is part of Abraham's dream. So he resolved both problems. Abraham is not saying he came to know how beautiful she is. Abraham is saying, I came to know that these are the flow of events that I'm about to encounter in the next day. This is how we're supposed to act in order to save ourselves. This is not, yes.
They've like combined the psukim. They've used a different.
Right. It's a very different way of reading the text. It's so creative. And I want you to remember again, these are the most ancient interpretations of Sefer Bereshit out there. It's not the only one. We said there's intertextual interpretations. There's some Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, but this is the same time frame. These are the most ancient attempts to deal with these problems. Just that makes them so special. And in this particular case, it's such a creative, not pshat, but Chazal are also not always pshat. Chazal are also sometimes deviating from the plain sense. We can't accuse the scroll for abandoning the plain sense, the literal meaning of the text. And it's such a beautiful and creative way, which shows that the people in the community of Qumran, or whoever wrote the scroll, were very, very creative in the way that they try to deal with same issues that would also trouble Chazal and also commentators in the Middle Ages. If you want to read more about this example, I'll tell you where I took it from. This is also mentioned by a 2-volume series about the Megillah put out by Yad Ben Tzvi in Hebrew. And there's a long article by Professor Kugel, who's changed his name into Kaduri recently. He has a long chapter about biblical interpretation in Qumran, especially with regards to the Torah. And he talks about this example. There are other few examples. There are not so many cases like this, but there's a lot to do and a lot to learn, especially if you're dealing with the first parshiot, the first portions of Sefer Bereshit, the story of the flood. is elaborated there. The story of Lemech, you can find some information there. So there are a few passages in the Bible that you can analyze in a similar manner. This is just a glimpse. Obviously, it's just a glimpse of this book. Needless to say, it's even less than a glimpse when we talk about this whole treasure. But we have only one session to devote that we're devoting to each type of material. Next week, we'll talk about a different set of sources, and that will wait for next week. I think next week we will address ancient poetry as a form of interpretation, and we'll move on to Parashat Vayera. We'll talk about the stories from the following portion. Ayla.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I am so glad you made time on this Time to Learn today with us. I hope to see you all next week at the same time. Take care, everyone, and have a good day or evening.